Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Em. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator here at Rockland Public Library. We are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's event. I want to thank the Camden Conference for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and a couple quick housekeeping notes before we get started. For those of us joining on Zoom, which I think is that camera right now, but it might be that one, but I'm pretty sure it's that one. Hello and welcome. Please make sure to keep your camera and microphone off for the duration of the talk, and then if you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to type them into the chat, and I'll read them to Bill as we go, or at the end during the Q&A period. And then those of us joining in person, also welcome. And if you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I will run one of these handheld mics over to you so that Zoom can hear your question as well. And I think that that's it from me, so I'm going to turn it over to Bill Bachhovner, who is from the Camden Conference and will be introducing tonight's speakers. So welcome to Bill.
Thank you, Em. On behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. And we'd like to thank Rockland Public Library and the Friends of Rockland Public Library and Em and her staff for hosting us again this conference season. The Camden Conference, as many of you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers from our community. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. In keeping with our mission, we offer a series of community events like this one, leading up to our annual weekend conference. These free events are intended to provide background on the yearly topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in its three-day format. This year's conference, our 37th, India, Rising Ambitions, Challenges at Home, will take place February 16th through the 18th, 2024, live at the Camden Opera House and streamed to both Rockland and Portland. Tonight, as part of the Camden Conference community events, it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Hall, who shares his insights into the India-Russia relationship by asking, does the tiger still like the bear? Bill Hall was an intelligence officer for the United States Air Force, serving on active duty from 1969 to 1999, much of the time overseas. He grew up in Virginia and received a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton and a master's degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Bill lives year-round on the warm and much less windy Peaks Island today. With his wife, Nancy. He's past president of the World Affairs Council of Maine and serves on the boards of several Maine nonprofit organizations. Please give a warm applause for our guest, Bill Hall.
So I was joking with Bill earlier that Peaks really is a nice, warm, sunny garden spot of Maine. And these were animals in our zoo on Peaks Island, so I thought I would include them in our pictures tonight. But when the Camden Conference contacted me and said, you know, could you do a community talk again? I volunteered this particular topic, and you were the only library to accept it. So, I think there was some confusion about what is this about a tiger and a bear? That doesn't sound like anything we need to know. But it really did, because I was trying to figure out, okay, what represents India, and a tiger represents India, and a bear represents Russia. So I wrote this little kind of description of what the answer to the question is. Does the tiger still like the bear? It appears at times, yes. But as India rises and Russia declines, and it's all relative, of course, the formerly close relationship between these two giants has clearly changed, going from admirational to transactional. A mutual attraction has turned stale. Is it a long mutual attraction, in fact? What happened, and what does this evolution mean for the United States and for the global order? So that's kind of what I'm going to try. That's a lot, isn't it? But I'm going to try to cover some of the highlights of that in this presentation today, to take you through a little bit. You could read on this topic forever, I discovered when I started doing research. but take you through a little bit of the history around it, and then kind of see where we are today. What's the relationship between India and Russia today in pretty broad terms? I don't really cover much in the way of detail. But then what does this mean for India and Russia, and what does it mean for the United States? And if you take it up another level, what does it mean for the global order? I won't get much into the global order, except to say that it's really now a multipolar world. And everything we do in the United States has to be geared to that kind of thinking. So does the tiger still like the bear? And let me get started. Hopefully I'm pushing the right buttons. And I have to apologize. For some reason, the churn of history just sounded like an exciting phrase to me. And so I repeated it multiple times in this presentation. But it just did. There's something about it that I really liked. But I started the sort of digging around into this topic with India's independence. So India became an independent country, from the British being the sort of the empire, part of the British Empire, still part of the Commonwealth, by the way, but in 1947. And it started in a very rough manner, as you all probably know, with partition, where you split this area that had been India as a whole into two different countries, which were actually Pakistan and India. And then just to add to the confusion, there was a piece of Pakistan on the east side of India as well, which later became Bangladesh. But so you've got this independence going on, but it's 1947, and at the same time, you've got this emergence of the Cold War. So this new country has got to sort of bring itself into the world of nations, right? But it also has to deal with this huge split in the global the globe, basically, between East and West, which is the Cold War. So India has to fit into that. And I think that's really an interesting part of the story. So you have Nehru becoming, and for a long time, serving as the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. And he is trying to figure out, well, how do we make this poor country grow, economically? How do we give people opportunities? We've just split off into two different countries, but how do we make this country grow? And pretty much adopts a model that is top-down model for growth. So very different from what you might consider the liberal economic model, right? Where the market rules. This is top-down growth. And I think a lot of that was borrowed from his appreciation of Russia and the Soviet Union, and looking at what they had accomplished, which I admit they'd been through a horrible war, so a lot of the country had been devastated, but Russia, the Soviet Union, really had, by all appearances in 1947, had accomplished a great deal in terms of growing the country. So if you're looking around for an economic model, one of the places he turned, I'm pretty sure, was to the Soviet Union. So what do you have? You have 5-year plans. This is, India at the time. You have state-owned heavy industry. And that was where he put a lot of emphasis, where the state would own key sectors of the economy, like, steel production, for example, transportation, energy. All of those things would be owned by the state, and the state would build those up and then run them. And that was a model that Nehru proposed to, in fact, actually implemented in India. That's sort of the commanding heights model, right? So where your government takes over what they consider to be the commanding heights of industry and economics. And then he instituted trade barriers. So you couldn't bring foreign-made products into the country easily, right? There were high tariffs, and that kept the foreign competition down, which in theory would allow the country to grow its own domestic industry. And then private business regulation. You couldn't just start a private business in India on your own. You had to go through permission from the government. And there was what they called the license Raj, right? You had to get a license for everything you did. If you wanted to start a private business, you had to go check in with the bureaucracy and get all these different licenses in order to be able to run that business. So there was private business, private commercial activity in India all during the Nehru's time, but it was difficult, it was challenging, and heavily regulated by the state. So there is a really close relationship right from the early days of India with Russia, with the Soviet Union at the time, because of that kind of thinking about how you build your economic strength. And I think there's a really pivotal year here, though. In 1955, I thought this was really interesting. There were two big visits that occurred. And again, this is India drawing toward Russia, drawing toward the Soviet Union as a model. But Bulganin, who was the prime minister, premier of Russia, or Soviet Union, and Khrushchev, who was the party leader, visited India. They spent a lot of time there. It was really amazing for two top leaders of one of the major countries on earth, right, to spend as much time as they did in India. They spent a great deal of time there. And then Nehru revisited, went over to the Soviet Union, and he kind of reciprocated the visit. And I thought this was interesting. I got a quote here from a book I read, which was written by a woman who was an Indian civil servant for a full career, named Ashila Mulek, and she described this visit that occurred in 1955. I'll just read this to you. So in June 1955, Nehru made a 17-day visit to the Soviet Union. Can you imagine one of our, say, a president visiting another country for 17 days? I thought that was really, really remarkable, where he was given a tumultuous welcome. A multitude of Russians and banks of flowers lined the streets of Moscow and other cities of the Soviet Union, which he visited. The Bolshoi Theater gave a command performance commencing with an impeccable rendering of the Indian national anthem by Russian singers and musicians. Nehru and the people in India were overwhelmed by the welcome and reassured by the presence of a friendly and powerful neighbor whose foreign policy was anti-imperialist. This was of interest to India at the time, anti-imperialist. That was important. And before leaving, Nehru stated, "I am leaving my heart behind. We did not come here as strangers, for many of us have followed with deep interest the great changes and developments that have taken place in this country." Of course, he's talking about Russia's, the Soviet Union. To fortify the friendship, the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Nikolai Bulganin, and first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, visited India and traveled across the country for 3 weeks. Again, I find these reciprocal visits to be truly remarkable. The long duration of these visits by both nations was unprecedented. These visits were a declaration of the bonds forged by both sides and were of mutual benefit to both. The visits marked a defining moment in Indo-Soviet relations. And I think that's true. 1955 was a pivotal year for India, certainly, and its relationship with the Soviet Union. And again, when I'm later on, I didn't start active duty till the late 60s, but truly, I even then felt like India and Russia were at least close pals, right? They were really pretty much together at a lot of what they did, a lot of what they said. So you had these mutual visits going on, and 1955 also marks the Bandung Conference of the non-aligned movement. And this again ties Russia, Soviet Union, and India close together. Because again, the spirit of the non-aligned movement was, we are not going to join military blocs, right? And military blocs was a term used by the Soviet Union. It was sort of an amusing term because it was as if the Soviet Union didn't have a Warsaw Pact and a military bloc. They would always inveigh against military blocs, right? As if it didn't exist on the east side, right? They would mean, of course, NATO. They would mean not only NATO, they would mean CETO. They would mean anything the United States had done in the world to build a military alliance. And that was how Russia defined the world. The military blocs. So you want to be anti-imperialist and you want to be against military blocs. and you don't want to align your country with any of those military blocs. That it was ambiguous, putting it mildly, but that was the non-aligned movement, and India became a leader of the non-aligned movement, became one of the almost, I guess you would say, the most visible and prominent leader of the non-aligned movement, starting in the mid-1950s. But times drift on and changes happen. So by the 1960s, we're already seeing things happen that you would not have predicted 5 years before, because China and Russia are having certain disputes about their border areas, for example, that really are getting a little bit violent. And there was actually a military clash between China and Russia in the early 1960s. And there's an India-Chinese conflict that sparks up around that time as well. When China comes in and invades in the 1950s, late 1950s, they invade Tibet, and they scoop Tibet up into the Chinese Republic, right? And during this time, then all of a sudden there's a conflict on the border, because there's Tibet, there's India, there's Pakistan. All these countries are kind of clustered together in that area. Then there are Chinese and Indian conflicts that are going on as well. And then you have a Pakistani shift toward China. Pakistan, looking for protection against India, had shifted some of its allegiances to China. So this is making a much more complicated situation. How do you keep staying non-aligned? How do you lead the non-aligned movement when you have all these complications, when you've suddenly got hostile powers on your borders and you don't have agreements about exactly where those borders lie? So I just think that these times are starting to change, and India is under some stress. But I have to show you this stamp. This is 1981, so this is a few years later, right? But still, India is still embedded in the non-aligned movement. And one of the aspects of non-aligned movement was against military blocs, but also against what looks like, if you're looking at it from the outside, colonization. And India treated Israel as a colonizer. So here's a stamp, 1981, an Indian stamp, solidarity with the Palestinian people. So this is treating the Israeli-Arab dispute in the Middle East as an example of, to some degree, Israeli colonization, which again was against the spirit of the non-aligned movement. But I thought that stamp was kind of interesting. So here the churn keeps going. There's more churning. But it is, again, following this history is fascinating, because you have all these issues that are out there, all these big countries trying to figure out their relationships. And while they're trying to figure all that out and they're sort of settling on models, the models are being upset by all the changes that are going on. So there's nothing except fluidity out there, right? You can't ever settle on a foreign policy that you think is going to last forever, because challenges are arising left and right, and things are changing very fast. So the big change now. So in 1955, think about the Camden Conference, the non-aligned movement, the drawing together from Indian independence with India using Russia as a model, right? And invading against military blocs, which I always thought was interesting. But now you've got Nixon going to China. So there's a major change in the setup, right? So you've got a whole new world out there. Now, India is not being terribly friendly with China at this point, but you've got Nixon visiting China. Then you've got a war between India and Pakistan over East Pakistan. Same year, 1971. So the United States is now approaching China cautiously, but we're approaching them. And then Pakistan is trying to preserve East Pakistan. The East Pakistanis, even though they're Muslim, don't feel part of Pakistan, right? They're not represented in the government. The vast majority of the government ministers, the government leadership in Pakistan is West Pakistan, what you think of as Pakistan today. East Pakistan feels completely left out of this. Not that their culture is very different, maybe Muslim, but it's a completely different landscape, for example. A totally different landscape, totally different way of making a living. And oddly enough, East Pakistan is per capita is wealthier than West Pakistan, which is interesting too. So here you go, East Pakistan really does want independence. Pakistan moves its army over to East Pakistan to prevent this from happening. And then what you've got is this war going on in East Pakistan. East Pakistan, of course, obviously later becomes Bangladesh. But you've got and this is interesting from my military Air Force intelligence career as well. The United States is supporting Pakistan. So, this doesn't help our relationship with India at all. But we're supporting Pakistan during this fight. And we're bringing the 7th Fleet over from the Pacific to get into the Bay of Bengal to support Pakistan. And India, non-aligned India, is then going to the Soviet Union saying, hey, we got these US ships that are now in the Bay of Bengal supporting Pakistan. We're bringing our army over to stop to kick the West Pakistanis basically out of what then became Bangladesh. And the Russians send in their ships. So here you've got the Russians, as one of the descriptions says, they sent in their submarines. And they made sure that they described it as nuclear submarines. So you've got this potential clash between Russia and the United States over the issue of East Pakistan. Didn't happen, but the Indians are forever grateful to the Soviet Union for sending support that allowed them to defeat the Pakistani army and then allowed the country of Bangladesh to be created. They're so grateful. In 1971, this is another big deal, big issue. India and Russia signed a treaty. This is the first time India had ever done this. Again, India, non-aligned, right? That's what they say they are. But for the first time ever, India, I would say formally, now, how tight this is and whether it would actually work in certain circumstances is unknown, but they really are allying themselves with Russia in 1971 with this treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation between India and the USSR. So what it obligated each country to do was to provide, if one of the parties was threatened, the other party would respond. Didn't say how. Didn't say it would, jump into the fight, but it did say it would respond with support. So there's a treaty that, again, very important development, very much tying India to the Soviet Union. Very important from the standpoint of this history. In 1974, India feeling threatened by not only, just in general threatened, but you've got now Pakistan is truly your enemy, right? And there are border disputes with Pakistan as well. But you've also got a little fight going on with China at the same time. So India develops nuclear weapons. A lot of the technology came from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union helped India build the civilian nuclear industry that India built. That was really important. And believe me, every time a country builds a civilian nuclear industry, they learn a lot that is applicable to weapons later on. So that's what India did. India developed nuclear weapons, became a nuclear power in 1974. Just to add to this turmoil, this churning, right? The churning. In the 1980s, not only did Nixon visit China right in the early 70s, but by the 1980s, we're starting a whole new economic relationship with, guess who? China. And India and China aren't buddies. So this is interesting too. This creates another stress point for Indians to try to deal with in their relationship with the United States. So we're creating, now there are a lot of countries involved in China's economy, right? It's not just the United States. Germany's a big player and there are a lot of other countries. But the opening really to China was led by the United States. And this is another complication for India to deal with. So the churning continues. I think I have one more churn to go. Yes, one more churn. So again, all these things are happening in their environment. And then guess what happens? 1991. The wall falls in 1989, right? 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves to everyone's great surprise. Truly, this was surprising. At the same time, now this has a huge impact on India. I'll read some of the comments that the author that I previously, well, actually, the comments were quoted by the author. They're written by Time magazine. I'll read those comments to you because I think it's interesting how India reacted to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. At the same time that's happening, India is facing all these economic problems, right? So if you look at these things all seem to happen together. So you got India losing its best buddy, and at the same time, you've got an economic model that is not working very well. And if you look at, again, commanding heights, government control, the license raj, all the import, tariffs, all those things, only parts of those things have been done by other Asian countries. And the other Asian countries that were highly successful, like South Korea, for example, and eventually China, and eventually Japan obviously had already shown the way to do this. Singapore, even Indonesia, all these other countries had passed India in economic growth because they had not followed this same commanding heights model. Now again, the government was, in all those places, the government was a big player, right? It's not they stepped out, but at the same time, they allowed much more flow into the country, and they decided that their model is going to be efficient, cheap production of goods that they can export to richer nations. India hadn't adopted that model yet. And India is falling behind now the rest of Asia in terms of its economic power. But just to add to the fun, the Soviet Union is disintegrating. So their basic response. And this is the Indian response. This is a Time magazine piece. Wait a minute, sorry about that. There was a Time magazine. This is a Christian Science Monitor. Let me get that right. The Indian response to the end of the Soviet Union. I love this. This is so cool. In India, the mood was something like mourning. A dear friend had passed away. India's national press, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, full of lively editorial analysis, sees the world differently, never more so than since the 9th of August. Americans saw the Second Russian Revolution as the breaking out of freedom. Boris Yeltsin, the freedom fighter, courageously defied the tanks of totalitarianism. It was the end of a dark era, even in the face of anxiety about who controls the nuclear warheads and whether chaos could be averted. Not so in New Delhi. India's guarded media reaction to the coup is and this is in August, so this is August 1990. So there was a attempted coup against the Russian, basically against Boris Yeltsin, leading Russia. Reverberating upheavals that followed reflect India's markedly different attitude toward the Soviet Union. India feels orphaned. Strategically, economically, the Soviet Union was not just India's friend and neighbor. Socialism, secularism, and democracy comprised the Congress's party ideological trinity. Being progressive, on the cutting edge of historical change, and on the moral high ground. I think that's really important when you think about India's role in the world and India's, dedication to the non-aligned movement. Meant sympathy for, though not emulation of entirely, the Bolshevik Revolution. India's ideological identity was intertwined with that of the Soviet Union. Nehru thought he could industrialize India democratically by combining Soviet-style planning with parliamentary democracy. I mean, it was a good thought, right? It wasn't quite working. The Bolshevik Revolution purported to be anti-colonial and anti-imperialist, stands that appealed to the Indian nationalists who had won independence from the British Empire that circled the globe. After Nikita Khrushchev's 1955 visit, India began to rely on the Soviet Union's strategic support. The Soviets cast vetoes at the UN for India. When India used force to erase the remnants of Portuguese colonization, and that was Goa, for example, and the Kashmir question appeared on the agenda. It supported India in the wars with China in 1962 and with Pakistan in 1965 and 1971. The Cold War spawned the Nine Line movement that gave India a world role and opened the way for Pakistan to challenge and the Soviet Union to support India's dominant role in South Asia. And its nuclear arsenal, it's the Soviets' nuclear arsenal, helped it, let's see, yes. Well, I'm not sure whose nuclear arsenal is. Could be India's nuclear arsenal by this time. And its nuclear arsenal helped India to avoid an overt answer to China and Pakistan. The Soviet Union was critical to India in India's economic calculations. One of the world's leading arms buyers in the 1980s, India acquired most of its arms from the Soviet Union at bargain basement rupee prices. India's protected and regulated economy fit well with the Soviet command economy. So it was really, for the Indians, this was a real sense of mourning when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, because that was really a strategic pillar for India. In the 2000s, India finally decides that it needs to work on an economic opening. So you allow more of the outside influences to come in and participate in the Indian economy. It's still not easy, but there has been quite an opening. And then in the 2010s, you've got India now no longer having the Soviet model or the Soviet support that they had before. India adopts this foreign policy that they call strategic autonomy. And it's strategic autonomy, which means India can, case by case, make up its mind what it's going to do, right? And no other country is going to influence that. That's what strategic autonomy is about. And there's no real doctrine. It's other than India is an independent country. India can make its own decisions. And it's a multipolar world now, right? And it's becoming, I would say, even more multipolar than it was before. The first 10 years at least after the Soviet Union fell, it was a unipolar world. Everyone the United States is running the world. That has gradually changed, as we're all very much aware, into something that's much more multipolar. So there you go. This is the churn of history. So then that brings you to the question I was trying to answer, which was, well, what's the relationship now? Does India still like the Soviet Union? And I just sort of said, well, what did they gain from this long relationship with the Soviet Union? Well, they gained status, right? Because now you're a friend of a big power. Right? That gives you some status in the world. I mean, they're a big country anyway, so they already had that status. But they're also friends of the Soviet Union, which at its time, gave India status that it wouldn't have had otherwise. At a practical level, it gave India real support against Pakistan, softer support against China. Now, Russia and China weren't having really terribly good relationships, but Russia was very cautious about getting too involved with India in Chinese issues. But Russia was supporting India for membership in the Security Council of the United Nations, which I think is an important issue. Ideas for economic growth came from Russia, right? That's kind of was what they're within. Again, it was command heights, but it was also democracy. So kind of not all Soviet, but still a lot of that came from the Soviet Union. Economic assistance came from the Soviet Union. This relationship heavily favored India. So when I say India was getting arms at bargain prices, they really were. The Russians weren't getting a lot out of this, other than I'll talk about some other things they got out of it. But from a purely economic standpoint, the big gainer was India. Nuclear technology, which was important for India's development of nuclear weapons. And then they got what they thought was strategic balance. They could add the weight of Russia to their own weight and have influence in the world that otherwise they wouldn't have. Pakistan, to me, is fascinating because I remember as an intelligence officer, we loved Pakistan. So remember I said 1971, when there was a little war between India and Pakistan over East Pakistan, I remember getting all kinds of intelligence from Pakistan. We had a big intelligence base in Peshawar, Pakistan, that looked at China and Russia both. So we would track missile shots in Russia because it was nicely placed for the missile test areas in Russia. We would also track China, see what was going on in China. And we'd also land our U-2s there. Remember the U-2s? Gary Powers and the U-2 mission. The Gary Powers was the last U-2 overflight of the Soviet Union, I think. Not totally sure. But I think it was the last flight. But the missions would fly out of, among other places, Turkey. And a lot of times they would land in Pakistan. So I remember as an intelligence officer how dependent we were on the intelligence from our relationship with Pakistan, which was very important to us. Didn't make us friends in India at all. So, but anyway, that's what India got. Now, do they still like the bear? I'll talk a little more about that. But this is what they got out of the relationship. It was a very important relationship to India. The bear, on the other hand, what does the bear think? Russia got something too. I mean, you think about, well, India's getting arms on the cheap, but Russia is getting an anti-imperialist legacy, right? A legitimacy, a legacy for being anti-imperialist. And they're using Indian language and they're using Indian support to establish their, we're against military blocs, which I always find amusing. But anyway, they're an anti-imperialist force in the world. And India is giving that thing legitimacy, which I think is interesting. They're also getting access to the third world. The third world, remember that phrase? I don't think we use it anymore. It's gone. But in the day, we used to think of, the Western powers, first world, second powers, the second world would be, all this other Russia and places like that. Third world would be all the poor countries. But they would get access to what we would call today, I don't know, developing countries. They would get access to something we called the third world, which were the poor countries that were trying to develop, right? The developing countries, and most of which were staying not aligned in the military blocs, right? And they had access through India to that third world that they wouldn't have had otherwise. They had some natural resources coming from India, not very much, because most of the trade was from the Russians to the Indians. So right now, it's an interesting development, but it's really transactional. The emotions have gone out of it, right? When I read that piece from, I said Time, Christian Science Monitor, I misplaced that. But anyway, the emotions are pretty much absent now. Pretty much now it's a sort of a deal by deal, right? What's happening right now? What's going to be beneficial to us? What does Russia want? What do we want? Can we work a deal here? And that's a transactional type of relationship. So it's not quite the same as it used to be. India has a big concern though, and that is that there is, because of Ukraine largely, there's a Russia-Chinese axis growing. So Russia is now very dependent on Chinese support for what they're doing in Europe, invading Ukraine, for example. They're dependent on having a good relationship with China. China is not really fully engaged with this, but still is providing support to Russia in ways that really concern India. They do not want China and Russia to be drawing together. That's not in India's interest. So Ukraine war and Western reaction are driving Russia toward India. Now, what's that? Toward China, yes. Sorry about that. Yes, toward China. And this is a big concern for India. And it's the Western reaction. It's funny, they think NATO caused Ukraine, right? They really do. Mostly they think NATO gave Russia no choice but to invade, which I think is kind of an interesting argument. But anyway, the Western reaction to impose sanctions, is driving China toward Russia, and they think this is a very big concern right now. It's one of their current issues, so they are constantly reminding, and Modi did too recently, remind the United States what you're doing in Europe is making a Russia-Chinese axis that wouldn't happen without that. So there's now this is the still having a good relationship India and Russia agreed to have an annual summit meeting. So Modi would go to Russia, the Russians would come, Putin would come to India and so forth. So this is the picture from 2021, Al Jazeera. So this is a photo from their news release. And that's the annual summit in 2021. This is the 2023 summit. They're not the same people. And it's interesting. So when you're thinking about this relationship, there's some modifications to it. And that is, for the last 2 years, 2022 and now 2023, Modi has not gone to Russia. He's sending Jai Shankar, who is the Indian foreign minister. So now Jai Shankar is meeting with Lavrov, right, the Russian foreign minister. So that's the summit now. Now, is that going to continue? But it does reflect some thinking on India's part about the displeasure with Russia drawing close to China. So that's, again, a real sort of a pictorial of the difference in the relationship between India and Russia. So India and America now, this is an interesting thing too. Where are we going to go with this relationship now? And again, people have opinions. So if you have different opinions, let me know. Or if you have something more brilliant to say, that would be good to hear too. But political military, the situation is evolving. So now we have military to military contacts that we didn't before, with staffs, with operational units and so forth, that we didn't have with India before, because India was non-aligned, right? They weren't going to be involved in that. We have cooperative maritime operations going on right now, and we have arms sales. So now, oddly enough, we have become the leading provider of weapons systems to India, which is interesting. That's quite a change from the days when the Russians were doing that. This is, I would say the next bullet is interesting too. It's cautious. They're not jumping on board like an ally. And they keep making the statement, we're not aligned. We're not aligned. We're not an ally of the United States. But they are playing a cautious role in supporting the U.S. presence in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, because that provides them some strength against China. That's their main interest right now. So they are participating in the Quad, right? The United States, Australia, New Zealand, India. They are participating in that. There is an increase in trade between India and the United States. And of course, the Indian economy is growing, right? India is a possible friend-shoring site if we decide to pull some manufacturing out of China. So right now, Apple, among others, is looking at India saying, can we move some of our, because Apple is totally dependent on India, really dependent. Yeah, I mean, China. I keep mixing those two countries up. But anyway, China. But they're thinking about moving, well, some, maybe, I don't know. It's difficult. It's a difficult thing to do, is to move, because of the entire ecosystem in China for Apple is already created, right? When you move something like, your whole enterprise, you've got to move the ecosystem with it. So that's a very complicated move. But could India be a friend-shoring, as we say, friend-shoring place for U.S. production, or maybe other countries, maybe other Western countries as well that are heavily involved in China right now? Ukraine, different views about the cause and effect. India thinks the United States, by pushing the expansion of NATO right up to Russia's border, had left Russia with no choice but to conduct the operation that it's conducting now. I would say that is a necessary but not sufficient argument. Don't think it explains everything, but India's pretty much bought that argument, that this whole thing is being brought on by NATO and NATO's aggression, actually. NATO's interest in continuing to expand right up to the door of Russia. And Indian oil purchases help Russia. There are two countries buying Russian oil like crazy right now, among others, but Turkey and India. They're really heavily involved in buying Russian oil, which is funding, eventually funding the war of Russia against Ukraine. And it's really amazing. Those two countries are really the sanctions really aren't working too well. One, because Russia already had a big, huge bank account before the war started, right? They're drawing down on that bank account. But the other thing is, there's a lot of energy sale going on by Russia right now, because they have countries interested in buying it. And it's interesting, I have these great pictures on another talk I did showing this huge line of tanker trucks winding up through Georgia, going into Russia, all filled with fuel. And it was coming from a Turkish port. So the tankers are coming in, Russian tankers or unnamed tankers, right? Coming into this port, offloading the oil, being picked up and driven through Russia and into Georgia and then into Russia for final. I mean, it's really interesting, driven all through Turkey. So Turkey and India are two major purchasers of Russian oil, which really does help Russia out in this war. And then Indian domestic spillover. Have you read the paper lately? India conducted an assassination in Canada of a Sikh nationalist, right? And then they had a plot going in the United States to do the same thing. And Trudeau not happy with that at all. There's quite a spat going on between India and Canada right now. And the United States, I'm sure, has had some strong words about this plot that was upset and stopped by the FBI, basically. And then the other question that comes up, our Democratic friend in Asia, and that is a good question. If we hope to have good, friendly relationships with India, we'd like to improve them in some ways, but is it really going to be the friend that we're looking for in South Asia? And these two do get together, by the way. This is the G20 summit I think it was September this year in New Delhi in September, and Biden was there for that summit. So we do have some sort of summit level, high level political relationship going on. And does anybody remember Trump and Modi? When Modi came over and they had this, I think it was in Texas, they had this giant rally that was really incredible. It was like a huge football game, and it was really amazing to see. So again, there's at the top leadership level, there are friendly relations between the United States and India. Well, now India, the Camden Conference, among other places, got to deal with these kinds of issues too. But India has some challenges internally, as you all know. Hindu nationalism, big challenge right now. So Modi was elected with a majority in 2014 to become the Prime Minister of India, and has promoted Hindu nationalism in the country. And there are huge ethnic and regional differences in India still today. So the country isn't one country, it's a whole bunch of other places all combined under the country of India. And it is amazing how many divisions there are in languages. I don't know how many languages are spoken in India, but a lot, 14, 16 different languages, and all sorts of different ethnic divisions in the country. And then the other question is it a democracy? And I've heard it called an autocratic democracy. That means you still vote, right? But the environment around that vote has really changed, right? And it's changed because the judiciary has changed, the media has changed, and your access to the ballot has changed. Does this sound a little like kind of the United States right now? So we got the democracy still going on, right? But we got a whole lot of environmental changes going on around that democracy that lead you to wonder. So is it an autocratic democracy? Is it a democratic autocracy? Who knows? But it's not, it's in a lot of ways, Modi has changed the environment to the point where it doesn't look quite as open as it used to be in terms of democratic rule. And then there's external politics questions. Replacing the non-aligned movement is the Global South now, which is an expression which no one agrees on what it means, but really it's talking about those countries that were in this non-aligned movement. A lot of these countries are, some are pretty advanced now, but they're still not quite, in per capita terms, not as advanced as, say, the United States, Western Europe, and they're still developing, and that's really the Global South. And India still wants a leadership role in that, so they're not so much in the non-aligned movement anymore, but they do speak a lot about the Global South. The strategic autonomy in the multipolar world, and that is India's line right now. That's where India wants to go. And the United States has to think about that too, because we are truly in a multipolar world. And that makes a lot of our sort of global actions and our global thinking and our global perspective on the future more complicated than it was before, because there are other big players out there that are getting bigger all the time, China being obvious, huge example of that we now have to deal with in anything we do in our foreign policy. And then is India a world economic power? It's now 5th largest economy in the world. Isn't that amazing? Of course, it's a big country, right? It's got 1.4 billion people. It has more people than China now. So it's going to have a lot of economy anyway, but it's a growing power economically in the world. And that's, again, the United States has to take that account in dealing with our relationship, our mutual relationships. And I think all that's going to be discussed at the Camden Conference. And I think it should be a fascinating topic. So not only is India food good, but there are a lot of really good issues we could talk about as well. I love Indian food. So there you go. The last thing I want to mention is the Camden Conference is coming up. And I think it should be something, it would be really, I'm very much looking forward to it, because I think it's going to deal with a lot of these issues I've talked about, maybe not so much the history, but it's going to talk about things like strategic autonomy in a multipolar world, and what does that mean for India and Russia relations? And not only that, but India and US relations as well. So that's my talk tonight. And anyway, does India still like the bear? Yes, but, and that's all I have to say. And I'm welcome to take any questions if you'd like. So.
Excellent. Anyone want to get you? There we
No?
go. Hello.
Okay.
Let's get rolling.
Somebody has to go first. This is probably under the category of voting with your feet, but there are like 4.1 million Indians living in America. Yeah. Is there any migration to Russia of Indians that you know of? I'm just wondering how the government may feel about this.
I really don't have the answer to that. I don't really know. I don't think it's anywhere comparable to the US because of the kind of economy, the more or less open economy that we provide, and the advantages we provide to people who come here, especially from India, because typically we've been drawing on, as you know, the more educated class and people who, English is a good, solid second language for them, and they come here to go to our schools and get into our high-tech world, and they do a really excellent job of doing that. I don't think there's similar attraction in Russia at this time, but I don't really know the answer to that question. I really haven't looked at it, so that's just a thought. What's that? It's a lot colder. It's like, yeah, it's kind of like Maine sometimes. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, President Biden laid on a big visit for Modi last summer.
He did.
And one of the speakers that's coming to the Camden Conference in February has said Biden made a bad bet on India because when push comes to shove with China, as it may over Taiwan someday, India will not, he says, give any military support to the United States against China. What do you think Biden's overarching purpose was of that, laying on that big state visit?
Yeah, I think he's trying to push India more in the direction of supporting us politically and militarily. And I think the other individual you mentioned coming to the conference is probably right. India is so cautious about at what level they want to get involved with the United States militarily. I wouldn't think of them, and they would be happy to have this answer actually, as any kind of an ally at this point. At best, as a cooperative relationship, like the relationship with Russia, it's transactional, right? But I think that's true. So I think there's some element of truth to that comment. So.
Anyone else in here?
So I had two questions, if I could be greedy. One, with strategic autonomy, is it fair, with that picture you had of Jaishankar and Lavrov, is it fair to say that strategic autonomy has less to do with Modi and more to do with Jaishankar? That's the first question. And then the second question is, Um, you used to read about bricks, and now with Ukraine, you read about RICS and RINKS and these different acronyms. And your talk didn't mention bricks, RICS, or
Right.
RINKS much, and so I was just wondering if you could comment on those.
Sure, right. So I think Jaishankar is more interested in the strategic autonomy than Modi is, but that would come from at least the perspective of where they sit in the Indian government. Jaishankar being the foreign minister, very interested in that. The other thing, I think Modi has so many internal issues to deal with that he probably doesn't think as much about strategic autonomy as somebody else, maybe like, Jaishankar in the Foreign Service does. So I think Modi is, I think he believes in strategic autonomy. And believe me, strategic autonomy is a nice way to say we don't have any other choice. They're not going to ally. They're not going to sign, treaties of alliance with anybody else. But at the same time, it's a way to sort of explain or rationalize the situation that they're in, where they are going to have to go sort of from here to there without any overall blanket sort of a model that they're going to be able to use. And it's going to be a transactional relationship with everyone else in the world. And I think Modi and Jaishankar agree that the world is, if I could use this term, fragmenting into a much more multipolar world than it used to be. So I think there's a difference of emphasis more than anything. I think Modi still believes that. And then the BRICS is another interesting thing because you've got Brazil, Russia, I think this is interesting, Russia, India, who was that? China, Russia, and India, China. This is very interesting collection. And then South Africa, right? So you got the BRICS, and India is part of the BRICS. And the BRICS are, well, not surprising, since it goes Russia and China, not happy with Ukraine at all. And India is part of that group, part of that grouping. And the BRICS do meet, right, as a group. And they've recently decided to expand and they add more countries. I think it was 6 more. I'm not sure if I got that number right, but at least add 6 more countries to the BRICS collection. So it's hard to say exactly what all that means, other than it's another opportunity to get together and talk, which it is. And to some extent, if it's of interest to them, and this will really depend issue by issue, it's a transactional thing, whether it's useful to cooperate together, form partnerships on certain issues, and sort of operate in tandem. But where that's going to go, I'm not really sure right now. So, yeah.
Thanks. I'm looking for some insight into the political will of the Indian people. I think of China, it's a totalitarian system. Perhaps she gets by advancing their economic things, and that's what they care about. Russia, I think, is a totalitarian. We're going to scare the pants off everybody, and if you raise your hand, you're going to get your head chopped off. India has legendary corruption, legendary government bureaucracy. How do they keep making it work, especially because the Indians seem to have access to international information and know that the United States is better or things are, how does that work? What are they thinking?
You have to come to the Camden Conference.
Well, I'm going.
It's a really tough question to answer. It really is, because the United States really is, to a great extent, a model for India that Indians look up to. And Indians who've come to the United States have done pretty well as a group. They've done very well. They won't find that anywhere else in the world right now. The United States is probably, yep. Right.
They take all of these tests, and the very smartest ones
Yeah.
then come to the United States or something, but it's a real test, and it's legitimate. They kill them. It's like Japan. They kill themselves for this,
Right.
for these series of tests, but they know about democracy. They have a literature. They have a heritage of democracy. They've got a leg up because they speak English, or English is a sort of a mother tongue, sort of. And I don't know how it still works.
It's a very good question. It really is. Not one I can easily answer, as you can see. But yeah, but it'll be interesting to hear the speakers at the Camden Conference deal with that kind of an issue. Absolutely. Because they do have a democracy. They are familiar with it. They have a British heritage. They don't regard that as all great, but it's still a heritage to them. And they do like the United States for what the United States can offer Indian people and offer the immigrants that come to the country as well. So yeah, good question. I just have no answer for you. It's like the rest of the world. You're always dealing in contradictions and things that don't agree with each other. Yes, we had one more question. Yep.
Hi. Well, there'll be several
Mhm.
comments. Another factor that is puzzling how it isn't more damaging to their economic and overall is caste. They have not escaped caste. And our experience and our impressions are so much formed by the Brahmin upper class educated. And they are often the ones we see here in this country.
Right.
Part of that notion that they're tolerating the U.S. naval presence, China's Belt and Road is trying to put, creating harbors and airports and so on, and then the loans fail and China takes them over. India can feel like they're getting somewhat encircled in that scheme. But the one that seems to me most troubling is the extremism becoming more apparent in the ethno-Hindu dominance. And I don't think without that, they wouldn't have tried this assassination in Canada and in the States. It was poignant to see that image of the heads at the Gandhi Memorial, at the rallies for Modi's party. There are no images of Gandhi. There are images of his assassin, who is now celebrated as a Hindu hero because Gandhi was going to tolerate a multi-ethnic, Hindu and Muslim state. And that's to be utterly deplored, and anybody who fought against that is to be venerated. I mean, that seems to be where it's headed, and I think that's trouble.
I think I absolutely agree with you. In fact, I'm turning the rest of the program over to you. But it's true. That is absolutely true. And when you think about India's population, it is one of the largest, if not the largest, Muslim population in the world. There are 200 million Muslims living in India. Okay. Yeah, more than Pakistan, exactly. Yeah. So where that's going to go with Modi and the Indian nationalists, the Hindu nationalists, with such influence in the country now, that's a really good question. So where does this all end up? Yep. Right. Yeah. Uh-oh. Yes. I think we got one more question. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. Where does the relationship between the United States and Pakistan stand now, with the United States wanting to create a more amicable relationship with India?
It's much, much weaker than it used to be. It really has declined a lot. So now the arms sales that we used to do, we don't do anymore to Pakistan. So it's a completely different relationship. And then when we were engaged in Afghanistan, 20 years in Afghanistan after 9/11, we depended heavily on Pakistan to support our effort first against the Russians, the Soviet Union, which was involved in trying to shape its own government in Afghanistan, right? And then when that all fell apart, then the aftermath of all that, we relied heavily on Pakistan to give us support in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Pakistanis were supporting the other side. They were supporting us when, to a degree as well, but they were also supporting the other side. They were supporting the Taliban. And they were hosting Osama bin Laden in their own country. So that relationship has definitely changed. It doesn't have any of the same closeness that it had, 20 years before. So it's changed a lot. Pakistan is still aligned with China. Exactly. Yep. So The Belt and Road, just to comment on the Belt and Road too, it's really interesting because the Chinese have built a major port in Pakistan. So they got a big port in Pakistan now. They go down through the Indian Ocean, they come out, they have another big port in Sri Lanka. So there is a big concern on the part of India, as you said, that the Chinese with the Belt and Road are sort of surrounding them. So another issue for today and strategic autonomy.
Did I see one more
Okay.
hand, or is that it for questions? I think that might be
Okay.
it.
Well, I hope
All
I
right
see
then.
you some at the Camden Conference coming up in February.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bill. This is fantastic. Thank you.